chapter of Anatomy and Physiology will introduce you to the basic principles of anatomy. We'll get an introduction by looking at the definitions of the word anatomy and physiology. We'll do a brief review of some of the characteristics that we discussed in biology. Particularly, we'll look at the definitions of metabolism, anabolism, catabolism, and excretion. We'll talk about the levels of organization in body systems, kind of pick up where we left off in general biology. Talk about gross anatomy versus histology as the types of anatomy, and then look at the language of anatomy and physiology. That's what you hear a lot of complaints about. Oh, anatomy is hard, the words are hard. We have to understand their origin to understand the difficulty. The last thing is we'll focus on the principle of homeostasis. All of anatomy focuses around homeostasis and the core principles of how we maintain homeostasis. General introduction then. We want to talk about the definitions of what is anatomy, what is physiology. Well, anatomy is your form, it's your structure. If we're studying the bones of the body and you learn that the name of this bone is the ulna, the name of this bone is the radius, you're studying the anatomy, the actual form. When you learn the layers of the skin or the integumentary system, you're learning the anatomy. The physiology would be to study how those bones function together. If we study how the radius and the ulna unite and create a joint, then we would talk about the physiology. How that joint then opens and closes like a door hinge to make the hinge joint, that's the physiology. Now, there's sometimes you can separate these, and some courses do. You'll take a course on human anatomy, and you'll just focus on the parts. Or you might could take a course on physiology, where you just focus on how things work. But in reality and truth, the easiest way to study this is together, because in anatomy and any science, form dictates function. Things are built the way they're built so that they work the way they work. Or you could flip that around. Things work the way they work because they're built the way they're built. Why does your cabinet door only open and close? Because the structure of the hinges only allows it to open and close. Structure determines function. When you start to study these, this is your very first objective, define anatomy, define physiology. You want to make sure that you're working on brevity. You want to be brief. We don't want to memorize a whole bunch of extraneous or extra words. You want to focus on the key. Well, if you'll notice, I've kind of done that for you. If you're studying anatomy, I would put structure, or you might possibly put form. No need to put both. So then what would be your abbreviated definition of physiology? Physiology would be the functions of the body. In other words, the way the body works. Just remember, you can't really separate the two. Although there are courses that allow you to separate the two, they're best studied together. All right, your next objective asks you about defining metabolism, anabolism, catabolism. This sort of takes us back to biology when we talk about this whole long list of characteristics of living organisms. Living organisms are organized. Living organisms are made of cells. Living things metabolize. Living things reproduce. They grow, they develop. We want to come back and really just focus on this metabolize idea, because this is what separates us from a lot of the other living organisms. What separates us from the mushroom and the mold and the trees? We are a dynamic organism capable of metabolism. We do it very well. We go through all these chemical reactions in the body and we break stuff down and we build stuff up all the time. If you eat a hamburger for lunch, and we'll be plain, we'll just eat a burger with a bun. Well, when you eat that burger with a bun, you're taking in protein, the hamburger, you're taking in carbohydrates, the bun, and your digestive system is going to metabolize that hamburger meat and that bun. Now, really what's going to happen is your digestive system is going to catabolize that hamburger meat and that bun. We're going to take the protein of that hamburger meat and we're going to break it down into the building blocks, the amino acids. That's what catabol means. It means break down. So for an example, when we break the protein down into the monomer, the building blocks of the amino acids, this is catabolism. That bun we're eating, when we break that carbohydrate down into the monosaccharides, that's catabolism. Now, why does the human digestive system do that? Because we don't have a mechanism for bringing in the big protein. We have to get into smaller parts. The digestive system catabolizes it, brings it in to the bloodstream, and then the cardiovascular system will deliver those amino acids to other tissues in the body where we'll turn around and do the opposite. We'll take those components and undergo anabolism. We'll build up. We'll take these amino acids that we broke down and we'll use them to build a new protein. Or we could have done the carbohydrate example. We catabolize the carbohydrates into monosaccharides, then we turn around, absorb those into the bloodstream, carry them all over the body, rebuild those monosaccharides into disaccharides and bigger things. Metabolism is what makes us a very unique living organism. Now, when you break down and when you build up, there's always going to be waste. Think about a building site. Building sites are never clean. Even though you're building something new, there's a lot of waste. There's extra materials left over. When we are building proteins or when we're catabolizing and breaking down proteins, there's always going to be waste. The waste is what dictates that a human body must excrete. It's the way we get rid of what is potentially those harmful waste. Well, what if we don't excrete? Well, unlike a building site that would just be messy, we would be toxic enough that we would die. Our cells would take that waste back in because, after all, things move from high to low till they hit equilibrium. That's a basic biology principle. So if you had all these waste sitting around outside of the cell, eventually the cell would bring those waste back in, makes them toxic. So out of all the characteristics we talked about in biology, the organized, they're all important, but we do want to take a moment then and just revisit what was metabolism, anabolism, catabolism, and excretion. When you start studying things like this, I always encourage you to use any tip or trick you can to help you remember these. After all, every objective just keeps building and building, and the units just get bigger and bigger. I'll give you one of my weird tips. Maybe it'll help. I grew up a dog person. I just always liked dogs. For some reason, cats just weren't my favorite. They tend to kind of hover around your legs and rub up all over you, but really what bothered me about them was the way that they scratched on everything. They scratch the door frame, they scratch you, they scratch. For some reason, I always associated cats with scratching. I know, dogs chew, let's don't go there. I'm just talking about the ability of a cat to always scratch. When I associate cats with scratching, I associate that with breaking down. Now, where am I going with that? I remembered that catabolism, cats break down. That's how I remembered the difference in catabolism and anabolism. So try to find yourself some little neat trick or weird memory thing to help you learn these terms. All right, we'll move then to the next objective. Make sure you're referring to your objective list. That's what your test is built off of. The next objective asks you to describe the levels of organization of the body system. Well, now we're really going to take a trip back to biology. If you think in biology, we started out with what's the most basic component? We said, well, the basic component was an atom. Atoms were built of protons and neutrons and electrons. Those electrons hovered around the nucleus. We talked about losing and gaining. Well, then we said those atoms, naturally, they're not stable. So the atoms, in order to achieve stability, put themselves together in these complex structures referred to as molecules. So here's where we began. Atoms then made molecules. Then we spent a while talking about macromolecules like carbohydrates and proteins. We talked about lipids and nucleic acids. And after we spent some time building these macromolecules, we started to build something even bigger. So in biology, we began at the chemical level. It's the smallest level. Now, keep in mind though, the chemical level is not a unique feature to living things. The countertop, the desk, the computer screen you're watching this on, it's made up of atoms and molecules, but they're not living. So once we had these atoms turned into molecules, we started putting all these macromolecules together to build organelles. We started to build mitochondria and Golgi apparatus and rough endoplasmic reticulum. We built a cell. The cellular level is the next level of organization. Then we spent the entire semester beating the cell to death. We talked about its membrane and the organelles and photosynthesis, cellular respiration and mitosis and meiosis and cell. Now this is where anatomy is going to pick up. We went through in biology the chemical level, the atoms making molecules, and the molecules started to build cells. Well, now we're going to combine cells together to do something bigger. That is the building of a tissue. When you put two or more cells together for a common function, you've built a tissue. This is where we'll begin anatomy. We'll build tissues first. We'll take two parts. We'll take the cells that we learned in biology and the surrounding material, the extracellular matrix, and when we put them together, they will serve a common function. Muscle tissue. Muscle cells with their extracellular matrix that function to contract. Nerve tissue. Nervous cells with their extracellular matrix that serve to communicate among the body. Right, so anytime you get a list, you don't want to go past 3 things without stopping and going backwards. So where are we? Levels of organization. We are first arranged at the chemical level. Atoms make molecules. Then we built cells to the cellular level. Well, you put a group of cells together doing a common function, and now you have a tissue. Well, what happens when you put several tissues together? You put 2 or more tissues together and you give them a shape that we recognize and a special job. Now you have an organ. Your stomach has a recognizable shape and a job. It's the storage container that we put food in when we're waiting on digestion to happen. Your esophagus, it has a recognizable shape and its job is to push food from your mouth down to your storage tank, your stomach. When you put tissues together and they have a shape that we can recognize, meaning I can go into an autopsy or a cadaver lab and pull the organ out and go, ta-da, see? When you can see it, recognizable shape, you have an organ. What if we take all the organ systems that are doing the same big job and put them together? Then you build an organ system. If you are 2 or more organs and together you're doing a big function, you're an organ system. Big function of the digestive system. Take in food, break it down, absorb the nutrition out of it. If your job is to move blood through the body, you're a system. You're just the cardiovascular system. If your job is to cover and protect the body and isolate it from the external environment, you're the integumentary system. So we keep going, we keep building. Let's stop, let's back up and make sure we're okay. The cellular level is where we began, atoms making molecules. Then we are at the cellular level. We're putting all those molecules together to make a cell. You put 2 or more cells together with a common function. You build a tissue. You put a group of tissues together with a definite shape, something I can see, and a function, then they're an organ. Put a group of organs together that all share the same big job, you're an organ system. Well, you put all of those organ systems together and you're, ta-da, a big organism. Now, this has a name, and this name's on your objective list, so don't focus on it too much, but just understand the big picture. The method in which we teach you the human body, by starting in biology at the most basic atomic level, and then slowly building over the biology, anatomy 1, anatomy 2, into this big picture, it actually is referred to as reductionism. We've taken the big complex human body, we've reduced it down to the smallest part, and then we build on it. Once you complete your studies and you move out into your field of practice, you're not going to study anymore, you're not going to practice anymore this reductionistic approach. Instead, you want to move to what we call holism. You want to look at the body as a whole and realize, even all the way down to the atomic level, how one thing affects another and they work together. So we're going to study it reductionistic. Otherwise, it's way too overwhelming. Ta-da, big complex human body. Makes you want to scream. We break it down in the smallest, simplest parts. We build slowly on the parts. And at the end of these 3 semesters, you'll have a good, broad overview of our organism. Now, types of anatomy. There are a lot of types of anatomy, and you can read through your book and see all kind of examples. But the 2 that we're going to focus on this term will be the gross anatomy and what we refer to as the microscopic anatomy. We're going to do a lot of study of what can you see without a tool. What can you see without any help? I don't need a microscope. I don't need a magnifying glass. I just need to look at the body. If you look at a lot of the models in the classroom, you can visibly see the muscles, you can see the organs. That is what we call the gross anatomy. But sometimes that doesn't tell the full picture. You need to look at that on a microscopic level to really figure out how the things are working together. So we'll also spend a good bit of our time on what we call the histology of the body. We'll take very thin sections of human organs, put them on a slide, give them stain, dye, project light through them so we can see the histology, the tissue look. And in some cases, we'll even be studying the cytology. We'll look at the cells themselves. If they're round, if they're flat, columned, they're in different shapes. Does the shape matter? Well, think about the very first slide. Anatomy is the study of structure or form, and does that matter? Well, in science, the answer is always yes. It really matters because the shape determines the function. So, other than the large quantity of information to learn in anatomy, what is so tough about it? Well, what's tough about it is the language of anatomy. It's difficult because it's not our typical language. Most of it is Latin. It has a Latin root or a Greek root, and it's just not what we would call our everyday language. This using language of science, it's easy to master if you'll get used to some kind of different techniques. One you'll see me do a lot is this. You'll see me split a word, and I'm going to write below this one. Ology is the study of, physio is function. If you can learn the root words, the prefixes, the suffixes, then you can figure out any complex anatomical term. We'll work a lot on focusing on root words like cardio, heart, gastro, stomach. We'll start to add prefixes and suffixes to that. For example, this is a suffix, ology, study of. We could have added a prefix, the study of, tachycardia. Cardia is heart, tachy is fast. On the flip side, bradycardia. Brady means slow, cardio means heart, slow heartbeat. There will be some Latin and some Greek, but the good news is that along the way there are some English derivations of them, and when English is available, we will use the English term. That way when you're studying, let's say, the muscles of the leg, and you run upon this word, peroneus longus, and you're like, oh my, I do not have a clue what peroneus means. Well, the good news is the English derivation of that word is fibularis longus. Well, at least now you know, okay, we are at that bone called the fibula, and based on that term longus, I'm thinking it might be kind of long. So now I know fibularis longus instead of the term peroneus longus. We'll use that English. The other thing you need to know about anatomy is where it's moving to and away from. Anatomy at one point used a lot of what we refer to as eponyms. That was an N there. An eponym means to name something after someone, and anatomy is doing its best to push away from that habit. Why? It just doesn't really tell you what you're looking for. If I send you in the human body looking for the Haversian canal, you have no idea where to go look. But if I told you that the English version of that is the central canal, well, you still don't quite know what part of the body, but you know when you get there, you're going to be in the middle. Central canal. The islet of Langerhans. Well, okay, islet, kind of sounds like an island, but I have no idea who this Langerhans dude is. Therefore, I'm kind of lost. That would be the eponym, islet of Langerhans. The non-eponym version of that would be the pancreatic islet. Well, now you got a little better clue. You're like, okay, islet, island, pancreatic, kind of sounds like the organ pancreas. You'd be right. So now I know I'm looking for some island in the pancreas. The problem is some of the majors, particularly nursing and some of the medical field, is still using the eponyms. So as we move through Anatomy 1 and 2, you'll see the English terms, but you'll also see in parentheses the what we call eponyms. If you're a nursing major, I'm really speaking to you. You want to kind of pay attention. You want to go ahead and kind of suck it up now and learn the eponym in the English. That way when you move into your program, you are familiar with both terms because you're going to see both in your textbooks. The loop of Henle, properly called the nephron loop. I'll just present them to you so you'll have heard them before and you won't feel so lost. So, what's the lesson from this slide? Don't use an eponym. Even though you're going to hear me give them, I'm really kind of speaking to the nursing majors. We're moving away from eponyms. We want to make sure we take our words and we break them into a root word, a prefix, a suffix. Kind of helps us build our medical vocabulary. And when possible, we'll use the English. We're going to stay away from Latin unless there was no English derivation available. All right, we're moving on through your objectives, and we've made it down towards the bottom of the list. As I mentioned, this is a really short, small chapter. So now we're down to that last objective or two about homeostasis. Define homeostasis, what does it mean for anatomy, and how do we maintain it? Well, homeostasis is our ability to maintain the same place. Homeo, same, stasis, place. It is the dynamic ability of the human body to take any disturbance in our environment and correct it. Go outside in the middle of July when it's 100 degrees and a heat index of 110, we sweat. That is the way we maintain homeostasis. Go outside in February, maybe we'll rarely have a cold snap in the south and it is 25 degrees. Well, you're going to shiver. Shivering is our ability to correct the disturbance in the temperature. Our internal environment has a lot of these set points. And homeostasis kind of reminds me a lot of a seesaw, where you're never really fixed always on one end or the other. You may seesaw to the left and then seesaw over to the right, and then teeter over to the left and then teeter over to the right. Well, the ability to keep your seesaw going left and right, kind of over that pivot point, is homeostasis. If your seesaw gets stuck on one side or the other, you're sick. If we can't correct the imbalance, you're dead. So it's very important that we are able to keep our seesaw kind of balanced. Now, what kind of things do we balance? Well, of course, body temperature. Human body temperature is supposed to be around 98.6. If you get too hot, we sweat. You get too cold, we shiver. The pH level of your bloodstream should be between 7.35 and 7.45. Well, what if it gets off? Well, we have mechanisms in place to correct the pH. If we don't correct the pH, we're sick. If we don't fix it soon, we will die. Your blood pressure, your heart rate, your respiratory rate, the level of sodium in your body, the level of chlorine in your body, the level of oxygen, carbon dioxide, all of those are these coordinated variables we have. So we want to make sure that we keep our variables pretty controlled, and the way we're going to do that all comes back to keeping everything at the same place. It leads us to what we call the 4 core principles of human anatomy. So the 4 core principles, we're going to talk about a feedback loop, how structure relates to function, the idea behind gradients, which was introduced to you in biology, and how a cell has to communicate with a cell. Keep in mind, these 4 basic principles are all related back to keeping the homeostatic balance. What happens if you don't keep the balance? You get sick. No big deal, right? Well, it's not a big deal if you get well. The big deal is if we don't correct it, then we would be in a death situation. So core principle number 1, let's talk about negative and positive feedback loops. All right, we're going to work with the words. I'm going to start backwards. I need you to think loop. What does the word loop mean to you? It should kind of mean a circle, right? Well, a good circle, not one that I don't draw well. A good circle technically has no beginning and no end, right? We're not sure where it begins, we're not sure where it ends. It just keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going. That's kind of what's going to happen here. All right, feedback. What does that mean to you? Feedback means to receive some kind of information that tells me whether to keep going or whether to stop. You get feedback in a course. I send you feedback that says 89.4. That tells you to keep studying a little harder because you wanted an A and you're not quite there. Feedback. Your English paper is written well, but you have a lot of subject-verb disagreements. That's the feedback. It tells you the corrections you need to make. Now, negative is a little bit more difficult because typically when we hear the word negative, we think bad. We're like, oh, that's negative. That's not good. But in anatomy, negative doesn't mean bad. Negative, I need you to kind of think of in the terms of being corrective. You're too hot. We need to sweat and cool off. Negative feedback. correct the temperature imbalance. You're too cold, we start to shiver. I need you to shiver until you get back and correct and warm up. Negative feedback is about opposing whatever change is happening and getting us back to one of our set points. Sweating is one of the best examples. Blood pressure is a really good example. I challenge you to kind of think about examples that aren't even related to your body. The way your thermostat works in your house is negative feedback loops. You set your temperature for 72 degrees. It's a really hot, sunny day. Sun comes in through your windows, heats up your house. Your house gets to be 75 degrees. That is going to be sensed by the little thermostat. It's going to tell your air conditioning unit to kick on. And according to the words negative feedback loop, how long are we going to initiate this corrective action? In other words, how long is your air conditioner going to run? Well, it's going to run, loop, and run, loop, and run, loop, and keep running, loop, until that little bitty thermostat gets a message that goes, oh, we've corrected. We're back to 72 degrees. Kickoff. Walk around your house. Look for some examples of negative feedback loops. To help you, you're looking for some basic structures. All negative feedback loops have basic parts to them. One, they have a receptor, something to detect that we're not at set point, to detect the stimulus. You can kind of think about it like a sensor. In your air conditioning unit, you know the little thing on your wall, the little thermostat, most of them still have a little mercury bubble in them. That is your receptor. It picks up that the temperature's off. The control center determines, we're off. Then it's going to send a message to your effector, and your effector is going to carry out the response or the action that helps me get back or corrects the imbalance. So let's do sweating on this. What is the receptor that picks up the stimulus, i.e. the heat? It's your skin. Your skin picks up that you're warm. It sends a message to your brain, and your brain says, let me see, we're supposed to be 98.6. You're kind of feeling like 100. You're a little hot. Your brain, your control center, is going to then send a message to your effector, your sweat glands, and says, hey, sweat glands, how about make me some sweat? Let's cool this bad boy off. As we start to sweat, the sweat evaporates from our skin, pulls off some of the extra heat with us, we cool off. How long do we sweat? Till our skin no longer detects the heat and our brain no longer registers that we're out of this normal homeostatic range. You could turn around and do the getting too cold as well, except this time your effector would be your skeletal muscle. Because think about what happens when you get too cold. You start to shiver. The more you shiver, the more the muscles work. The more the muscles work, they generate heat. The heat generated from your muscles is what helps warm you back up. There's a second feedback loop, but this one is not corrective. The negative feedback loop is corrective. The second feedback loop is a positive feedback loop. So we still have the same words, right? Loop. So we're going to go, 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 go until we get some kind of input feedback that says we have hit whatever the benchmark is. Well, if negative is corrective, positive is doing the complete opposite. Positive's job is to make an action bigger and bigger and bigger until we get something happening really quick. Where negative is a corrective mechanism, this one's going to create a big change in a really quick amount of time. Blood clotting, childbirth are the two best examples of positive feedback loop. So work through the childbirth example. The baby's head pushes on the cervix. The cervix is the receptor. The cervix sends a message up to your brain that says, hey brain, we're under a lot of pressure down here. Your brain goes, you are. Let me send out a signal to the uterus that says squeeze. The uterus is going to be your what part? If the cervix of your uterus is the receptor, your brain is the control center, what's the muscle of the uterus? It's the effector. It's going to squeeze. Well, instead of correcting the problem, it actually makes the problem worse. Now the head is putting more pressure on the cervix. The cervix is telling the brain, okay, that problem just got bigger. No problem, let me squeeze a little harder. So we squeeze a little harder, the stimulus gets even bigger. So we do it again. We send a message to the brain sends a message to the uterus squeezes, this keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and squeezing harder and harder and harder and harder and harder until, boop, the baby's born. And then it's just over. About as quick as it began, it's over. Big change in a short time. These are not as common, and the problem with positive feedback loops is they can get out of hand. They can create disease-causing processes. They can create tumors and things like that if they're not controlled. But it is a way that the body can make a really big change in a pretty short amount of time. All right, so what are feedback loops about? They're about helping the body maintain homeostasis, right? It's all about homeostasis. All right, core principle number 2. One of the most basic principles is what we call complementary structure and function. You are always going to be built in the way that best suits your function. And this is at every level. Go all the way back to biology and look at the structure of the mitochondria. If you look at the mitochondria, the inner membrane of the mitochondria, the cristae, was folded. Why? That structure best meets its function. This is where those little electrons were bounced around like little hot potatoes to make ATP. Well, the more folding you have, the more surface area you have, the more room you have to bounce those electrons around. So, core principle is form suits function to help us maintain homeostasis. The third core principle is the idea that everything in science, and the human body as well, works on a gradient. Everything in science always moves based on a gradient. We move from areas of high to areas of low until we hit equilibrium. So let's go all the way back 30 minutes ago at the beginning of this lecture where we talked about metabolism and excretion. And I said we have to excrete waste. Why? Well, here's a typical cell. Here's the waste created. But what happens if we don't have a way of moving this waste out? Well, we're getting a gradient. In here we have high waste, or out here I should say, and in here we have low waste. So what do gradients say? They say if we don't find a way to take this waste and move it on, this waste is going to move back into the cell. So instead of taking in nutritional components to make ATP, instead of taking in nutritional components to build a protein, we'll start taking in waste because we have no choice. It's a gradient. Remember that the phospholipid bilayer is like a screen room. You can't stop water from coming in your screen room. It's going to come in. So gradients drive every process. Breathing, nutrient exchange, waste exchange, excretion exchange, all are based on the principle of a gradient. High to low until we hit equilibrium. Types of gradients. We'll look at temperature gradients. There are concentration gradients, which is the one I was mentioning. There's even pressure gradients. Things move around in your body like oxygen and carbon dioxide because of pressure that pushes them from one location to another. All right, the final core principle that helps us wrap up how we maintain our homeostasis is the idea that cells have to communicate. Cells have to communicate with each other for us to have this coordinated body function. If cells build tissues and tissues build organs and organs build organ systems, that only works if the cells communicate. Now we'll look at two communication methods, especially as we get later in the semester. Cells can communicate either by chemicals like norepinephrine, adrenaline, acetylcholine, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. Those are all chemical messengers. And cells communicate through electrical signals. The human body has electricity just like you would see in a battery, where you see a positive on one side of a battery and a negative on the other. Human cells as well are charged. If these cells don't communicate, how are we ever going to maintain homeostasis? How do we know that we need a balance if one cell is not telling another cell that the balance is off? It's very important that cells communicate between neighboring cells and even distant cells to make sure we've maintained homeostasis. So at this point, you want to stop, you want to grab your objectives, and you want to look through and make sure that you have a clear understanding of every one of them. Remember that your objectives are just as good as saying your study guide. Work through every part. The parts you're unsure about, you can rewind this video. It's the beauty of the video. You can just back it up and replay that one part.